Hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together about 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists from over 100 affiliated national movements worldwide. And today on ICMDA webinars, our 237th, if I'm not mistaken, we've got Dr. Mark Pickering from CMF UK, who'll be speaking on the subject of lessons from the early UK Christian medical movement. CMF UK is one of our oldest member bodies. So thanks for joining us for this fascinating subject. The founding General Secretary of CMF UK, Dr. Douglas Johnson, said it is inexcusable for a Christian to neglect history. And the Bible itself is essentially a historical narrative recorded so that we may years later learn the lessons of history, to be encouraged by the examples and, of course, the frailties of those who went before us, and perhaps to avoid some of their mistakes. But what can we learn from those early UK Christian doctors, nurses and students who really changed history in the 19th and early 20th century? And here to address this subject is Dr. Mark Pickering. Mark and I have known each other for, I think, 30 years now. We first met when Mark was a student a long time ago, and he followed me in the UK Christian Medical Fellowship, where he's now the chief executive for the last 6 years for the CMF, which covers both the UK and Ireland. It's the third biggest of all of our national bodies within ICMDA. Mark is a GP, that's a family doctor by background, and he works very much part-time as a GP in secure mental health units and prisons alongside the work he does with CMF. And his interest in the history of the UK Christian medical movement was particularly stimulated by having to lead CMF through its 75th anniversary year back in 2024. And this led him to do a lot of research and to write about the people and the movements that led up to CMF's founding in 1949. And we'll be sending you more detail about some of the work that he's done when we write to you tomorrow. So Mark, just a great pleasure to have you back again on ICMDA webinars. And we really look forward to learning these lessons that we can apply today from you. Thank you, brother. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Pete. It's great to be back on ICMDA webinars. So the last time I did one of these was almost 2 years ago. So you can look back there at number 152 if you want to. And that time we focused purely or mainly on the birth of medical mission. So related things and there. And as Peter said, it was our 75th anniversary of CMF, the Christian Medical Fellowship, in its current form last year. And so I did a lot of reading and writing around that to help celebrate and understand our own heritage, and was just so struck by the lessons that we drew out from that. And so that formed, there was 6 articles in our journal, Triple Helix, and then we formed that into a small book, which is there on the screen, called Lessons from the Archive, the Early Influences that Formed the Christian Medical Fellowship. And you can get that free. We'll put the reference on at the end as well. And that's got a few reflection questions as well. But I've certainly found that incredibly helpful. And I think for anybody who's involved in leading a Christian medical or dental association or Christian healthcare association, so many of the things that we'll be talking about today are really helpful and important. There will be a few things that I'll focus on today that overlap slightly with that previous webinar, but the majority of this will be new to this one. So we've already mentioned Dr. Douglas Johnson, who was the doctor who founding General Secretary of CMF. The top right, you've got him there as an old man. That's how most of us knew him. But we discovered this wonderful picture of him in the middle there as a young man looking determined and like someone who is going to change the world. And he certainly did. But the movement of CMF goes right back to the 1830s, which we'll hear a little bit more about. And there's a very real sense that we are all descended in some sense from these early pioneers. Pete's already mentioned that quote from Douglas Johnson: "It is inexcusable in a Christian to neglect history." And another another great Christian doctor leader that we all know very well, Pete Saunders, also said, history repeats itself. It has to, because no one ever listens. So the first lesson for us to look at today is the lesson of learning the lessons of history. And Romans 15 verse 4 is very helpful in that, because it says everything that was written in the past, that's in Scripture, was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. So endurance, encouragement, and hope, that's what I think we can get from learning about our history. So right back to the beginning, Dr. Luke was very much the first Christian doctor that we know of, companion of Paul. But many years later, some of the ancient medieval hospitals come about very much through Christian influence. So in the middle on the right there, you've got St. Thomas's Hospital, which goes back actually to the 12th century. Some of those buildings are still there today. And that's very close to where we work in the CMF office in London. It's now moved site, and on the top right, you can see the modern St. Thomas's Hospital just across the river from the Houses of Parliament there in London. But in those centuries since the Reformation, there were many great Christian doctors. We mentioned there Thomas Sydenham, Edward Jenner, both who did great things, vaccination, treating plague victims, etc. And yet there wasn't really a movement of Christian doctors after the Reformation until really in the early 1800s. And the main focus of the last webinar I mentioned was on how medical mission began in East Asia, in China and areas like that, through men like this, through Carl Gutzlaff, Thomas College, and Peter Parker. And they formed organizations such as the Medical Missionary Society in China, or the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society. And you can see some of the information about them there, and much more in the previous webinar. But there weren't any wider Christian medical associations. So those first organizations were very much outward focused on helping Christian doctors engage in medical mission, which was incredibly important. But that really all started to change at the end of the 1840s. At this place here, Guy's Hospital, that's in the top right there. So Guy's and St. Thomas's Hospitals are both joined together as a single National Health Service trust today. If you look in the top right of that middle picture, this is St. Thomas's, the ancient buildings, but you can look, if you've got good eyesight, in the back there. Guy's Hospital was founded right next to it. Thomas Guy was a governor of St. Thomas's Hospital, and he was a Bible printer, a very wealthy man. And he became concerned that there were lots of people that were not being cared for by the hospitals that were around at the time. Many people were being discharged with nowhere to go. They couldn't work. They didn't have a welfare state at that time. And so he invested his vast fortune in founding another hospital called Guy's Hospital next door to St. Thomas's. And in the medical school at Guy's Hospital, there were doctors, there were students, and in 1849, one of those doctors, called Dr. Samuel Habershon, who's there on the right, he got together with the Christian students there, and they started a Bible class. It was really the first example that I'm aware of a Christian union, a student Christian union. There had been beginnings in other places like Cambridge, but this is certainly one of the first, and here in London. And it soon spread to the other medical schools in London. At that time, there were 16 different medical schools in the UK, or in London, sorry, and that was more than half the total in the entire country. And that Bible class, the Christian Union at Guy's Hospital, is still going strong 176 years ago, actually now in 2025. So that's my second lesson from this, that as we'll see later on in the presentation, students are really key to any Christian medical or dental movement, and we really need to invest in them and to make sure that we're connected with them and training and supporting them. So there was the Guy's Hospital Medical School and the Guy's Hospital Bible Class Christian Union. But what came next? Well, this man here in the top right was a brilliant young Christian physician called Dr. Golding Bird, and he was a brilliant doctor. But he, like many of us, was tempted to see medicine as his idol. He worked very hard, overworked, and was tempted to have the idea that God could not do without him. So his biographer said. And he worked himself quite literally to death because he got rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease, which eventually killed him. But during that process where he was being humbled by illness, he couldn't work as much as he did. And God was doing something really special in him. And that physical frailty brought a spiritual vitality to him that was quite new. And just at the point at which God had worked in his life like that, he opened up the British Medical Journal in 1853, and he saw this letter in there. And I've just clipped a little bit from the top there, from an anonymous student saying, what can the association do for medical pupils? That was the British Medical Association as it was. And it was a real heartfelt plea from a student saying, please, can the doctors support the students? He talked about how difficult it was being a student, and he mentioned about the many temptations which surround a medical student. And he said, given that, can we wonder if he fall morally, fall into temptation? And so Dr. Bird wrote back, and you can see at the bottom right, that's a clip of the letter that he wrote back the next week. And he said, this is, we must be able to do something. We must be able to do something for our students. One of the things he said was that he was convinced that no great improvement will ever take place in the ethics of our profession without the religious training of our pupils. There was a fierce back and forth in the letters column of the British Medical Journal, but Dr. Golding Bird gathered around his medical colleagues, his doctor friends from around London, the London medical schools. Other people saw that correspondence. The committee of the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society that I mentioned a couple of slides ago, they saw that and they thought this is a brilliant idea. They wrote to him and they encouraged him to set up a Christian medical association. And it was a wonderful timing from God, really, because he received that letter of encouragement from them just a few hours before he went into a meeting with his medical colleagues. That really helped to encourage him. And together they formed the Christian Medical Association in early 1854. Fascinatingly, that national association had already been proposed by the students. So they had the idea, they had the vision, and they just needed the doctors to help support them in that. So the Christian Medical Association was the first ever full Christian medical association that I'm aware of anywhere in the world, where you had, yes, medical mission, fellowship, discipleship, student support, everything that we would see in a member movement of ICMDA today. And I mentioned God's amazing timing on the last slide, but there was nowhere more seen than in the life of Golding Bird, because we mentioned that he was physically frail. He was suffering from rheumatic heart disease. And it was only a few months after he founded the Christian Medical Association that he died at 39 years old. A brilliant career cut short by illness. You can see his grave memorial there on the right hand side. But he never knew what were the fruits, the full effect of his faithful actions. And later on that year, in November 1854, you can see the annual meeting, the first annual meeting there. That's a copy of the address that was published. And the chair of that meeting said that we may hope that this association may become the instrument of winning many souls to Christ. And certainly it did that. So that was the first ever Christian Medical Association anywhere in the world, as far as I'm aware. And now, after about 15, 17 years, that eventually ran out of steam by 1871, but they had demonstrated the need to a generation of Christian doctors and medical students for that. And one of the last things they ever did, that committee, before they finally disbanded, was to help plan for a London medical mission, something that would care for the poor and destitute of the inner city slums of London, which we'll come on to in a minute. But that's my lesson number 3 from this, that God sometimes may need to humble us in order to use us. Golding Bird was a brilliant physician, an excellent Christian doctor. He would give lots of time, free medical care to poor people, and yet he overworked and he wasn't ready to see what God really had for him of eternal value until sickness humbled him and made him more spiritually alive. So God may need to humble us in order to use us. So I mentioned the London Medical Mission just on the last slide. home medical mission was a real movement that came from Edinburgh, from the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society in the 1850s and 1860s. And the idea there was that there were many poor people in the inner city slums. They didn't have medical care. We didn't have a national health service. And so Christian doctors would train Christian students in medicine, in evangelism. They would often live on site at these places in a hostel, trained by a superintendent. We got William Burns Thompson there, who was the superintendent of that hospital. And generations of these students went on to become overseas medical missionaries and really to expand that movement worldwide. And William Burns Thompson was fascinating because he never managed to work overseas as a medical missionary himself, but he trained many, many others. And what he wasn't able to do, he enabled many others to do. He also started a journal, the Medical Missionary Journal. He would collect letters together from all the people that he trained and was connected with, put them in a journal, publish it, and encourage many others. And throughout the 1860s and 70s, he continued to do that. And this Edinburgh medical mission was replicated through many cities: Glasgow, Aberdeen, Liverpool, Birmingham, and then finally London. And there were lots of missionary doctors and nurses working together. And the lesson from that is really what William Burns Thompson was able to do was to get people on site, working together, living where they were. And it was putting that theory and practice together and building community. He found before that when the students were scattered around Edinburgh and then coming in to work and study and then going off again, it never really worked. But putting them together in a community, putting the theory and the practice together, that led to generations of medical missionaries going all around the world. And you can see that building down on the right is still there today. That's on the right-hand side is where that medical dispensary was. Now, I mentioned there doctors and nurses working together. This is a slight tangent from this. We talking mainly about the doctors and the medical associations. But as medicine advanced in the 19th century, so did nursing advance later. Now, caring for the sick was part of Christian discipleship for centuries, often in these great medieval hospitals, but it wasn't a trained profession. Until in the 19th century, medicine developed to the degree where the doctors really needed more skilled assistants, and so you had a skilled and trained profession that began to emerge. And many of the people, many of the ladies particularly, who drove that were Christians, driven by their passion and their faith. So Elizabeth Fry, at the top left there, was a Quaker. Most of us know her about prison reform, but she also was passionate about nursing reform. She set up the Institution for Nursing Sisters in 1840. Many of us know on the right-hand side there, Florence Nightingale, who really transformed nursing care in many people's minds after she went to the Crimean War in the 1850s. And she took people from Elizabeth Fry's institution and others. She came back. She set up a nursing school at St. Thomas's Hospital, where we showed you before, in 1860. And then other things like that. And many of you, if you watch TV, you may have seen Call the Midwife on the right there, which is a lovely drama about the kindly nurses and midwives working in East London in the 1940s. And that's actually based on a real institution called St. John's House, which was an Anglican Church of England nursing order, again founded in the similar period in 1848. So all of these Christian nurses and Christian nursing pioneers were driven by their faith to raise those standards and create what we now know as modern nursing. But all of them were inspired by a humble German pastor, Theodor Fliedner, and his wife Frederica, and they set up the Kaiserswerth Deaconesses Institute in 1836. Back in the early centuries of Christianity, there was this ministry of deaconesses, which was largely women serving the poor and caring for the sick, and they revived that there in Germany and other places. And it's amazing how much influence that had. Florence Nightingale was trained in that institution. Pastor Fliedner worked with Elizabeth Fry on prison reform. He inspired the founding of St. John's House and also helped to inspire the Mildmay Mission Hospital, which I talked more about in the first webinar I mentioned earlier. So that's my fifth lesson there, that these early nursing pioneers, they saw their Christian faith as absolutely foundational to raising standards. And it's a great reminder to us that life-changing faith should make us better professionals as well. back to home medical mission, and I told how that movement that started up in Edinburgh came down eventually to London, and the London Medical Mission was founded in 1871. And this wonderful military doctor, Dr. George Saunders, which is sadly no relation to Peter, but a great man nonetheless. He was a military doctor in the Crimean War. And there's a lovely story about how he was cared for by Florence Nightingale and witnessed the transformation that she and her nurses brought to the care there. And in his memoirs, he says that through some mistake, my death was announced in the British newspapers. I had to declare that I was still alive. But when I came to Scutari, that's the hospital where he was based and where Florence was based, I found that the hospital there now had every appearance of comfort and was unsurpassed by any other. And all the praise was due to the noble and indefatigable efforts of Miss Nightingale. A lovely story there. So he retired to London in 1871 and he ran this London Medical Mission. You can see some pictures of the building back in those days and more recently as well, because a fun fact there is it's still going as London's oldest fish and chip shop, which dates its birth back to 1871 as well. But while he was there, George Saunders launched the Medical Prayer Union, which was the immediate forerunner to the Christian Medical Fellowship today. So we said the Christian Medical Association ran out of steam a few years later in 1871. Just before they finished, they'd helped to found that London Medical Mission, which George Saunders then retired to run. And while he was there, a single solitary medical student came to him and said, can we do something about supporting Christian medical students? And he said, yeah, and he did. And he brought together his medical colleagues. He put the word out and they really started up more of those Bible classes. So just like had been done with Golding Bird and the Guy's Hospital students back in 1853, 1854, 20 years later, George Saunders and this unnamed medical student did the same. So that's my other lesson there, that again, students are key, but students and senior mentors can change the world together. So we should never think, I'm retired, I can't do anything. You as a retired person or an older senior member could inspire a single student, just like George Saunders did, and change the world through them by helping to set up the Medical Prayer Union. Also in that same building, George Saunders and his colleagues launched the Medical Missionary Association, which was the London version of the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Association. That was 4 years later in 1878. And that ran for 126 years, did very similar things to the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Association. They ran student hostels as well. They had a connection with a London Medical Mission in Islington as well, in North London. They trained and housed students, and one of the students that they trained in their hostel and housed was the great Dr. Douglas Johnson, who founded CMF. They sent out many missionaries. They also published their own journal called Medical Mission at Home and Abroad. And eventually, after those 126 years, it merged with CMF in 2004. And one of the other institutions connected with the Medical Prayer Union during that period was something called Livingston College. Something, again, that most of you probably never heard of because it doesn't exist anymore. But in 1893, one of those young medical missionaries who'd been trained and sent out, in this case to Nigeria, only aged 28, he got blackwater fever from severe malaria. He was invalided back to the UK. Must have felt incredibly frustrated that at the height of his youth, when he had all of his missionary time before him, he was sick and had to come back to the UK. But he started up this thing called Livingston College, Dr. Battersby, and they provided basic medical training for non-medical missionaries who were going out into these remote areas far from hospital. It was very much reviving the ideas that Carl Gutzlaff, who I mentioned before, had in the 1820s and 1830s when medical mission began. And Livingston College trained thousands of non-medical missionaries in short courses over 50 years. One of the people who lectured there was this chap in the right-hand side, Patrick Manson, who is in many ways the father of tropical medicine. And his first experience in lecturing on tropical medicine was here at Livingston College, and they were closely linked to the Medical Prayer Union. But it doesn't exist anymore today, and there's a very good reason for that, because the world had changed. After 50 years, by the late 1940s, the numbers coming on the courses had dwindled, the concept had become a bit outdated, national health services in the countries where the missionaries were going to were much better. There were fewer of these pioneer situations when a non-medical missionary needed to know some basic medicine themselves. And so they closed it down and they merged it back with the Medical Missionary Association. And that was a good decision in that situation. They didn't just limp on and try to keep it going when it wasn't necessary. So that's my next lesson, that sometimes things are right for a time, but then it's right to lay them down, because times and situations inevitably change. So as our organizations change, sometimes we may need to merge them. We may need to change something to stop a program that we've done for many years if it's not right for the time. That can be an excellent idea. So I mentioned the Medical Prayer Union, which was the immediate forerunner to CMF. That ran for 75 years. Coming up to from 1874 to 1949. And so it was when it was CMF's 75th anniversary, it was the 150th anniversary of the Medical Prayer Union. And they did some great things during their time. There were some wonderful people involved in there. So Dr. Harold Moody on the right there was one of our members. He was known as Britain's Martin Luther King. He came from Jamaica. He trained in London at King's College Hospital. He was an excellent graduate, but very sadly, he was refused employment as a doctor simply due to racism in the medical profession in London. But there's a beautiful story in there, that the president of the Medical Prayer Union gave him a job, trusted him, and gave him that job leading one of these home medical missions in Marylebone in North London. And Dr. Moody did an excellent job there. He went on to do many other things as well. He chaired and was president of different missionary societies. He ran his own racial justice organization, made a massive difference to the lives of Caribbean people in the UK and beyond. And part of that was certainly because of that partnership with the president of the Medical Prayer Union, who helped him out when he was facing racism himself. Another great pioneer is Dame Mary Sharleeb, who was a pioneer gynecologist. She went out with her husband to live in India, in Madras or Chennai. I think her husband was a lawyer. While she was there, she became aware of the suffering of many women, particularly in childbirth. So she trained as a midwife out there. She trained as a doctor out in India. And then she came back to the UK and also trained under the UK system, was one of the very first female graduates in medicine in the UK. And later the president of the Medical Prayer Union went back again to India as a medical missionary as well. So they did some great work in the Medical Prayer Union, but many of you will never have heard of them because, very sadly, one of the things that they did was they separated their graduate work from their student work. There were reasons they did that at the time, and yet one of the things that meant was that they didn't have that constant flow of students graduating and coming into the ranks of their graduates as well. And so eventually their numbers dwindled and they came down to very few people around the time of the Second World War. So that's my next lesson there, a mistake that was made in the Medical Prayer Union. By separating the graduates from the doctors, they really that led to the downfall of that organization. So it's essential that we keep strong connections between our students and junior graduates and our senior graduates as well for our long-term health. I talked a little bit about students, and we'll just take a slight diversion into the global student movements. Now, at the time that we're talking about of the Medical Prayer Union, there was a brand new evangelical student movement. It was called the Student Volunteer Movement, came from the USA, started in the 1880s, was an amazing movement of God across the world. Generations, thousands of students became missionaries, not necessarily medical missionaries, but some were medical as well. That eventually formed in the UK to something called the British College Christian Union, became the Student Christian Movement as well. And they were amazing. And they started very strong. They did mission, they did evangelism, they grew very large and influential. But in the early 1900s, they lost their way through liberal theology that was developing at the time. And some of those Christian unions that were linked to them started to raise questions about it, those in Cambridge and London, particularly some of the medics in London. And some of those Christian unions said, you've gone too far into this liberal theology, we can't stay with that. And they disaffiliated, they separated. That was a painful thing to do at the time, but it was the right thing looking back. Incidentally, it was that student Christian movement that the Medical Prayer Union gave their student work to in order to look after it. Might have been a good decision at the time, but when the student Christian movement faltered and went in a different direction, that was why they lost their connection with them. The SCM is still going today. They have a global version of the WSCF, but they're very small. They're not evangelistic at all. In the UK, they're mostly focused on LGBT advocacy and climate activism. It's a far cry from how they started. But those small evangelical Christian unions in Cambridge and London, they kept going and they stayed strong. And they formed the InterVarsity Fellowship, the IVF, in the 1920s. And one of the names that is well known to that was Dr. Douglas Johnson. He was the secretary of IVF for many years, and we'll hear more about him in a second. But as they grew, they maintained their evangelical focus, their trust in the Bible, in evangelism and mission. They eventually changed their name to UCCF, the Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship, and they gradually connected with other evangelical student movements throughout the 1930s, and that grew to be a global movement that's known today as IFES, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and many of you will know about them in your own country. So those early struggles from just a few groups of Christian students and graduates in the 1900s, the 1910s, saying, we need to do something different. That's not right the way that the student Christian movement is going. They separated, they were mocked, they were often laughed at for their scruples, and yet they were absolutely right to do that. And those early struggles that they had were definitely worth the fight. So that's my other lesson, that sound doctrine, having the right beliefs, is incredibly important, and it's worth fighting for. And these differences that may start small originally, they can become much bigger in time, and that gap can widen. So we need to be really careful about the beliefs that drive and guide our organizations. As the InterVarsity Fellowship grew, they had a new generation of Christian graduates. And so they had the Graduates Fellowship, which supported those graduates who were coming out of the Christian unions, who wanted to influence their professions. And many of those formed other groups within them. There were doctors, there were teachers, there were dentists and scientists, and independent groups of all of these came out from that InterVarsity Fellowship, Graduates Fellowship. So if we have any dentists today on the call, the Christian Dental Fellowship in the UK, which is our UK partner organisation, they became independent in 1952 and are also an ICMDA member alongside CMF. And it was that medical section of the Graduates Fellowship, it grew steadily. By the time of 1948, they were thinking of becoming independent. And just at that time, then they got some new contact from the old Medical Prayer Union. You can see two letters there. The top right letter was in the Lancet, which is a medical journal in the UK, from the final committee members of the Medical Prayer Union saying, could we start something again? Could we revitalize a Christian medical group? And Douglas Johnson and his colleague Ellison Nash from the InterVarsity Fellowship, Graduates Fellowship, they saw that, and this is their letter to each other, basically saying, that's great, but we don't want to have two organizations. Let's think about joining together. And so eventually they joined forces. So the Medical Prayer Union with the IVF Graduates Fellowship, the medical section, joined together, and they decided to form the Christian Medical Fellowship. And that was in October 1949. So that was just over 75 years ago. So that was the 75th anniversary that we celebrated in the UK last year. And I mentioned that one of the key figures throughout that time was Dr. Douglas Johnson, known as DJ. He was a fascinating character, was inspiring to many of us, and so influential. And yet, you wouldn't have thought it to meet him in some ways, because he rarely spoke at public events. You probably wouldn't have found him doing an ICMDA webinar. You would have found somebody else to do it. At conferences, he hated having photographs taken. Often he would find something else to go off and do when other people were having the photographs taken. But what he did was administration, strategic vision. So he wrote thousands of letters, had really influential one-to-one meetings with people. He ran lots of committees and took part in those. And through his strategic vision and his administrative skills, he had an incredible influence on 20th century evangelicalism. We've heard about IVF and UCCF. We've heard about CMF, IFES that he helped to found as well. Also the London Bible College, Tyndale House, the InterVarsity Press. And he was one of the very influential people who helped to launch ICMDA as a movement in the 1960s as well. So a wonderful inspiration, a great person, and yet definitely not your classic upfront leader. So the other lesson that I learned from that is you don't have to be that classic person who loves being on a stage in order to change the world. By using the gifts that God has given us, we can do amazing things. And just as I finish, one beautiful little story as well, because one of the things that Douglas Johnson had always planned to do since being a student was to be a medical missionary. He had it in his heart. He committed when he was living in the Medical Missionary Association student hostel to go to what's now Zimbabwe, that was called Southern Rhodesia in those days. And it really gave him a big dilemma, because as he was using his amazing admin skills to grow the InterVarsity Fellowship, people were saying, do you really want to go abroad as a medical missionary? Why do you stay here and run this organization? He thought, well, how can I do that? I'll be letting God down. And in that dilemma, his mentor, Dr. Arthur Rendell Short, really helped him. There's a beautiful conversation that's recorded between the two of them. And Douglas said to him, I was wondering what I'd do one day if I got to the gates of heaven and St. Peter said to me in a gruff voice, Johnson, why didn't you go to Rhodesia? And Rendell Short said to him, you just tell him to call me. And that settled it for him. And I'm so glad that Douglas Johnson did stay, did run the InterVarsity Fellowship, did run CMS and lots of other things beyond that as well. But he's still got to realize his dream to be a pioneer medical missionary. It's just that he did it in London. And he helped to start one of those other home medical missions. It's there on the right, the Lansdowne Place Medical Mission in 1932. He only worked there himself for less than a year, but he set it up, he got it going, he handed it over to others, and many years later that was still serving the poor in an area of London, actually very close to the CMF office, and that building is still there today, and it continued as a Christian GP practice in the National Health Service as well. So that's my final lesson there, that God can use us in more ways than we think. It may not be the way that we thought he would use us, he can still do something amazing through us. So what about us? A few of these pioneers that we've talked about in this presentation realized at the time that what they were doing was changing the world, and probably none of them thought that all these years later we'd still be learning from them today. So my question to you, to all of us, is what might God be leading you to do, either personally or through your organization? What are some of the lessons that you might need to learn, maybe some of the ones that we talked about today? And how might he change history through you, through us, individually, together? It may be in ways that we don't expect, but let's trust him that he will do that. I mentioned that the material I've talked about today was a series of articles in the CMF journal. You can see all those online, and you'll get the links to those when Josh sends around the notes tomorrow. You can also read about that in the combined book. There are lessons from the archives, the early influences that formed the Christian Medical Fellowship, and the link to that free PDF online is there as well. So thank you very much for listening. And there you go. My email is there if you'd like to talk further about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. That's amazing. I've heard that history several times, but every time I hear it, I'm reminded or learn of something new. And we're really grateful to you, not just coming along and speaking today, but really for all of the time you've spent researching this and learning it and distilling it so that others can benefit. We've got some time now for question and answer, about 20 minutes or so. So, Mark, the first question from someone I think you know quite well, Howard Lyons, who, of course, was once the chairman of the Medical Missionary Association and was very involved in the merger you talked about back in 2004. Of course, he's been treasurer and board member at CMF UK and is now on the ICMDA board as well, with a very strong healthcare management background. So Howard is asking, there's been talk recently about the possibility of Christian benefactors setting up Christian hospitals in the UK. How realistic do you think that is, and how desirable? I guess he's asking, have the wheels turned again from an age when they were appropriate to an age where they might again be appropriate?
Yes, well, things change, don't they? And it is a great question. Many of those early hospitals and healthcare facilities were started by Christians because of their faith. And then now that we have a national health service, many of us have forgotten about that. There are some GP practices or hospices or some hospitals that have got a Christian foundation. But I think it's easy to think, oh, we couldn't do that. Now, it's hard to see in the UK how we could get a fully functioning tertiary hospital with with lots of cancer surgeries and things like that going on. But there are certainly ways that we can do that. GP practices or hospices still have Christian foundations, and it may be that there are certain foundations and certain areas of healthcare that are more open to that. I think there is probably more openness in some ways to what we call third sector, charitable or socially minded projects that can be set up alongside National Health Service care, public healthcare, and private profit-making healthcare as well. There is that gap in the middle. I think let's just wait and see, particularly as we think about how assisted dying assisted suicide might be legalized in the UK sometime soon, and has been legalized in other countries. As that changes, is there a gap for us to say, actually, here is something distinctive? I think there is many opportunities where some people are rediscovering the Judeo-Christian values that underpin Western civilization, much like Tom Holland talks about in his book Dominion and other things like that. So yes, I think there are some opportunities. We have to think very carefully about those.
Thank you. And people forget, don't they, that we wouldn't have a national health service if it wasn't for the fact that the British government back in the 1940s decided to nationalise a whole lot of big Christian hospitals. So that's, in a sense, Christian hospitals were all that there were before that. And of course, there are many countries in the world where there are still a lot of mission hospitals, church hospitals, and also some very big teaching hospitals, tertiary institutions, which are Christian. This next question, do you think the days of Christian mission hospitals providing acute care in developing countries are numbered?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on that, and there'll be people on this call who can answer that better. But I think certainly the world is changing. And just as many of these mission hospitals were set up at a time when there wasn't a well-established health service, that is changing. And it may be that some of them are coming in part to those health services, perhaps losing their Christian foundation. I think where there is an opportunity, we need to be able to think carefully about that. So I think there was a great, was it Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center that I think you visited in Tanzania after the World Congress, Pete? I was inspired by the stories you told about what amazing work they're doing still today in places like the Christian Medical College in Vellore in India. There certainly are some great institutions that are maintaining very strong Christian ethos. Having said that, I think there are situations when we do need to be willing to lay things down, just like with Livingston College that I mentioned in the presentation. We shouldn't just keep fighting on and slogging on just because something was good and it did fit in the past. And it might be that the funding has changed. It might be that the needs have changed. It might be that the culture has changed. And we need to be able to think, what is God calling us to do now in this situation? So we have to be willing to, yes, trust him that he might be maintaining something, but also that he might be calling us to do something new and more imaginative in the situation. I mean, I'm minded of many Christians working in gospel poor countries like Islamic countries, for instance, and they're not working in Christian mission hospitals, many of them, but there are lots of Christians doing amazing work in other institutions, and there's often just a different way to do things. So we've got to be creative and willing to think laterally.
Yes, that's really helpful. And as you say, the cultural, the historical faith context in different countries is different and different. It's not one size fits all. These groups these locations go through different cycles as well, of course. Which just reminds me, one of ICMDA's international partners, the CCIH, Christian Connections and International Health, has a webinar coming up on asset mapping of Christian healthcare education institutions. So medical and nursing schools, particularly postgraduate training centres across the developing world. And I've been involved in the committee that commissioned that report. And it really is astounding just how much is still going on and how much is appropriate. The next question is from Bill Griffin from CMDA US. He was saying, I'm inspired by the substantial growth of ICMDA over the past several years. What do you see as the keys to this growth, and how can we best keep this ball rolling? And I guess it's a question about some of the points you've raised, and particularly relating to the starting and strengthening of young movements, which CMF UK is not, but started that way a long time ago. So what do you think are perhaps the most important messages to especially young CMFs around the world?
Yeah, thank you. Great to hear from you, Bill. And I think some of those things that we talked about in the presentation, making sure that you're connecting with and supporting and training students and giving them opportunities to grow through the ranks as they go on to junior graduates, for instance, mentoring them so that they can see examples of senior people who are walking the road further ahead of them, making sure that our organizations are continuing to engage in evangelism and mission so that people are really seeing the impact of what a real Christian doctor or nurse or dentist can do, the saline process that ICMDA uses or supports in many countries. I think helping people to see how their faith integrates with their practice is so important, and also to help people to think how they can be an excellent Christian clinician and how that can impact not just on their colleagues, on their patients, etc. All of these things are really important. So I think it's harder when you get an established organization that has maybe lost its younger end, maybe lost some of the edge of these things that we talked about. It's great having conferences, but sometimes you can lose your way if it just becomes conferences when people who know each other get together and talk about the things that they enjoy talking about. If there isn't that edge, or if there isn't that real connection with the next generation and the mission and evangelism as well, then it's harder to keep those things going.
Yeah, so striking. And what you said, we seem to come back again and again and again to the importance of students and junior doctors and the importance of keeping a good link with those. The MPU dying because it lost touch with the students. We've got an anonymous question here, but with a number of upvotes. It says, thank you for your presentation. From your overview, I get the impression that the pioneers of Christian medical and missionary associations had a great concern for improving the access to good medical care for all. And I understand that systems of funding and provision of healthcare vary greatly across the globe. But how can Christian doctors continue this legacy of improving fairness and equality and access when so many decisions related to the features and priorities in healthcare provision are made or not made by politicians?
Yes, great question. I think there's numerous ways that we can do that. So first of all, we can start where God has put us. So it may be that in our own hospital, in our own practice, in our own area, that we might by ethical practice, by practicing with integrity, we may be able to have an influence there and to impact that in our area. We can often take opportunities to get into healthcare leadership. So in the UK, we've more recently started a network for those involved in healthcare leadership. We call it CHLN, Christians in Healthcare Leadership Network. We're having a day conference this weekend about that, really to help support people go into the next step in those leadership journeys so that they can keep walking that road as a Christian and maybe have an influence at those higher levels of healthcare. And depending on the situation, cultural, religious, or how much corruption there is in a particular system, it may be easier or harder for Christians to do that. But I think it's a really good thing to be able to do. And the diploma in healthcare management that ICMDA is launching now, I think is a fantastic way to support that. So if you haven't already heard about that or signed up for that, do that. Let me just take one other from the webinar chat.
Okay.
There was a great question from Tara in the UK about the influence of the Second World War, because CMF launched in 1949. And yes, very much the influence of that massive dislocation of society in the Second World War did have an effect. First of all, it was the final thing that killed off the medical prayer union. They were dwindling anyway, but as people went off to war, and then some of the older people died, that period of the Second World War really got them to the point where they had to do something new or to die. But also the graduates from the InterVarsity Fellowship, and many of them were coming back from the war, and they were really energized that they had to do something, they had to work together, because you couldn't have that old idea that it's just about being a nice person and a jolly good chap and society will be okay. They had seen just how society and the world could fall apart through fascism and things like that. So I think it drove them to come together and to influence society in a new way. And that was very much influential in the birth of CMF.
Thank you. So the next question here is not a question, it's more a comment and a story, but I'll read it out because I think it's inspiring. From Frank Cantor, who's saying, "Thank you for your excellent presentation, Mark, and lessons learned from the Christian Medical Missions Movement. I'm the spiritual advisor of the EMMS Nazareth Hospital," which of course you mentioned, which was started by Dr. Kalust Vartan, an Armenian doctor who studied medicine in Edinburgh and then went to Beirut, where he was not accepted due to his training in the UK. Isn't that interesting? The Anglican vicar of Nazareth heard about him and invited him to come to Nazareth, as there were no medical facilities between Jerusalem and Beirut. And we're told he jumped on his donkey, interesting, and rode down to Nazareth, where he started a clinic in the Old City in 1861. He and his wife, Marianne, and 5 children who died in their infancy are buried next to our hospital. And I recently visited their graves and reminded all our doctors at a staff lecture of our Christian heritage and the precious legacy we've been given to steward, and the need for us to give thanks for God's faithfulness to our institution over 163 years through the 2 world wars, the 1948 war. So just again, another little snapshot of one faithful person who answered God's call in weakness and at great cost took on this job, and then later 163 years later, we see there's still an institution going on there, which I know some of our listeners are.
Yeah, thank you.
Involved.
Thanks. And Frank, great to hear you. I would love to come and visit the Nazareth Hospital sometime. It's on my bucket list. We've been inspired by some of our friends in the UK who are on the board of the Nazareth Hospital, and just hearing about how that's gone over the years, and particularly how in the recent conflict, it's been a real shining light, a beacon of hope in a troubled region, and it's Christians there, bringing together Christian, Muslim, Jewish people. What a great example. So thank you for joining, giving us that comment.
There are quite a few interesting comments in the chat, which we haven't got time to review them all, but worth looking at, and we'll make a record of those. Michelle Messahar saying, again, I fully agree with the lesson you shared about the importance of engaging with medical students early enough in their career and connecting them with medical missionary work. It is far easier to direct the green twig than the full-grown big brown branch. A lesson there, get them while they're young. And then we're almost run out of time, Mark, but I just wanted to ask you, every organization, of course, has its own history, and each one of the 107 affiliated national movements in ICMDA has its own history. How important is it for the members of those organizations to know that history and to document it in the way that you've been able to do for us today for CMH UK?
Well, thanks, Pete. I'm biased, but I would say it's incredibly important. And I think just as I was just amazed as I did this research over the last few years. Now, I knew bits of these things, but to think, the people who were, yes, they might have had funny clothes 120 years ago or whatever, and talked with a different accent perhaps, and not had iPhones and internet, but so many of the things that they wrestled with are so useful for us today, just like I've tried to show today and in the previous webinar. And so I would say if you don't know about the history, try to find out. And if you do know about it, try to write it down, because if you can do that, the people, the situations, the decisions will hopefully inspire people for years to come. And we mustn't lose that because it's so important. And where we are today, the things that we're doing now today will hopefully inspire people in 10, 20, 30, 50 years' time. And we need to help them along that road. So yes, do be students of history and recorders of history, and let's make history together.
And of course, all of us can bring a contribution. If you don't know the whole history, you might know a part of it that no one else knows. So just to write what you know down, and others will gather up and join the threads together. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for informing us, but particularly challenging and inspiring us with the story of the history of CMF UK from its small beginnings and the way that God was faithful to it and still is going into the future. And let's, as the Apostle Paul tells us, let's learn the lessons of history and learn from them, and not be learning from our own mistakes, but rather those of others, along with the good examples of others. So it just remains to me to say, Mark's gone, but thanks again, Mark, so much for your input today. There he is again.
You're welcome. Great to be with you all. Thanks, Pete.
Yeah. And we do look to you as well. Thank you, because without your attendance and engagement, these webinars would not happen and they would not be carrying on. So thank you to each one of you who are here today. And we look forward to seeing you again soon on ICMDA webinars. May the Lord bless you in all you do for him.